Good evening. My name is Michelle Carr, and I'm an educator at the North Carolina Museum of History. On behalf of our staff, I'd like to welcome you to the debut of our new North Carolina Special Edition series. Tonight's program, Russia's War Against Ukraine, How We Got Here and Where Are We Heading, is presented by Dr. Graham Robertson, a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before I introduce our guest, I want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the museum's YouTube channel. I also want to let you know that following the presentation, Dr. Robertson will take audience questions. You may send us questions using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. Now to tonight's program. When Russia's tanks and artillery rolled into Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, the action signaled that the country was not just launching attacks on its neighbor, but beginning a full-scale invasion. The Russian offensive changed the world overnight. It is the largest assault on a European state since World War II. The invasion also caused the largest refugee crisis in Europe since that war. Despite mounting civilian casualties, Ukrainians continue to resist the invading forces. Join Robertson as he discusses the key events and patterns in both Russian and Ukrainian politics, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine. With the invasion now more than 1 month old, he will also assess what we have learned over the last several weeks and try to discern what the road ahead looks for both Russia and Ukraine. Dr. Graham Robertson is the Harold J. Glass USAF Faculty Mentor, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. His work focuses on authoritarian politics. He has written 2 books, most recently, Putin versus the People, with Samuel Green. Robertson publishes regularly in the Washington Post and other outlets, and has contributed many articles on Russia and Ukraine in leading academic journals. Please welcome Dr. Graham Robertson.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor for me to be here and to speak with this audience tonight. It's also very important to me to have the invitation because one of the tasks that I have, I think at this time, one of the duties I have, responsibilities I have as a professor of political science and as someone who's studied Russia and Ukraine for more than 30 years, is to try and keep this issue front and center for the people of North Carolina, and also for the United States more broadly, and to try and do what I can to help keep people informed about the roots of this conflict and where it's going and what they can do as citizens to help. So it's a real honor for me to be here and be able to be part of this program. So thank you for that invitation. My talk tonight is going to be, this is the North Carolina Museum of History, and so there'll be history in my talk, and this is very much a very important part of the story and an important part of trying to understand the current events. There'll also be data in my talk. I'm a political scientist, which means I collect data. One of the things I do a lot of is collect survey data, and I have been working in Ukraine since 2012, collecting data on national identity, on attitudes to government, attitudes to civic engagement, and on civil society itself. I've done a number of projects for the USAID, the United States Aid Agency, on civil society development in Ukraine. And I've watched this process and its growth and development over the last 10 years, and I'll hopefully share some of my impressions of that process through time. One of the things that I've been thinking since the beginning of this conflict, in fact, before the conflict, I wrote an article with Sam Green in the Washington Post on the 8th of December that essentially made the point that invading Ukraine for Russia would be a disaster, and that Ukrainian society had changed in ways and that would make military victory extremely hard, and even if military victory was possible, political victory would be impossible, and Russia would be stuck with this huge burden that could in itself bring down Putin's regime. And what I'll talk to tonight as we go through, I think, vindicates that analysis to a certain degree, and I'll lay out some of the reasons why we thought that back in December. I'll also acknowledge that we were wrong because we assumed that the strength of the evidence that Ukraine would resist, and that Ukraine would resist successfully, was sufficiently strong that would deter the Russians from invading, deter Putin and his entourage from invading. It did not, and I'll be perfectly honest with you. I like to acknowledge when I'm right, but I also need to acknowledge when I was wrong. I was very shocked by the invasion. I think many of us were. My friends in Kiev were shocked. I had a graduate student in Kiev right up until the 12th of February, so just a week before the war began. So there's been a lot of surprises on here. One of the surprises is I think some of the mistakes that the Russians have made. I'll talk a little bit about that, and as we go. There's actually an interesting article in the New York Times today about the extent to which Putin was provided with incorrect information from those around him, particularly those in the Ministry of Defense. So these are all kind of elements of the story that I'm going to tell. But let's start with some history. I'm going to put up some slides so that you can, because we can see some maps and follow along a little bit with those elements. Let me see. Hopefully. Now you'll be able to see my slides. So let's begin with a map of present-day Ukraine. It's always extremely important and useful to begin with maps and to sort of see where everything is relative to other places. And this map, I think, is particularly useful because it gives you some of the political context that puts this war in the broader perspective. So here we have Ukraine. It's very large. It's one of the largest countries in Europe. Has a population of about 40 million people. Located on the Black Sea. Long border with Russia, and an equally long border with Belarus. And you'll notice that the capital city of Kiev is very close to the border with Belarus. Between Kiev and the Belarus-Russian border is the nuclear plant of Chernobyl that many of you have heard of in the last few weeks. And so it was really this location in which Ukraine is effectively surrounded on two sides by Moscow, by Russia and Belarus, and then by the sea, and from Crimea on the bottom there. That's this peninsula at the bottom of Ukraine. So Ukraine was surrounded on three sides, and before the war began, the Russians massed forces on each of those three sides. You'll notice also that to Ukraine's west, that the next country over is Moldova. Moldova is not a member of NATO, so it doesn't enjoy Western protection. And it has part of that country is currently a sort of unrecognized semi-independent state that's very closely tied to Russia already. And so Moldova is obviously going to be part of the story going forward. Once we move further west, we get to Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic. These are all NATO members. And that's very significant when we think about going forward. So a war in Ukraine or a war in Moldova looks like one thing. A war in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania is a war with the United States directly. And so that's the sort of geopolitical context and something that I think is pretty useful and important to bear in mind when we go forward. A little bit of history. The city of Kiev dates back to more than 1,000 years ago. And when it was first sort of founded really as a trading post along the Dnieper River. You see the Dnieper River there. where Kiev is located. And the trade was essentially between Vikings from the north, the Rus, the people whose name ended up getting attached to the country of Russia, and the Tatar people, the down in the south. These are people of Turkic origin, and nomads in part. Really interesting history that we don't have time to get into tonight. But essentially, Kiev became was born as a trading post on this route between the north, between the Scandinavians in the north and the Turkic peoples in the south. The moment in which I've captured this image is in the period of between roughly 1750 and 1812, because this is a period that political scientists and historians think has been really important in shaping the culture and the political attitudes of contemporary Ukraine. You'll see on this map, current Ukraine is outlined in green, right? So you see the shape of Ukraine on the middle of the map, and you'll notice that it's divided really into 4 different empires, right? On the one hand, there's the Russian Empire at the east, and you'll see that expands up towards the Dnieper, up to Kiev in 1667. Beyond that is what's called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, which was the largest empire at one point in Europe. And then in the very west of Ukraine, in the city of Lviv, Lviv was acquired by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 18th century, in this period 1772 to 75. And then in the south, there's the Crimean Khanate, which is an autonomous Khanate, but associated with the Ottoman Empire. So you have Ukraine divided between these 4 empires: Russia, Poland, Lithuania, the Habsburg Empire, Austro-Hungary, and Turkey. And these different parts of Ukraine have had different political, social, and economic development ever since. And to a certain extent, an arguable extent, historians always like to argue. But there is some evidence that the political characteristics of these regions are quite different and follow significantly some of these imperial borders from the past. So it's worth bearing in mind that this is a territory that it really hasn't existed in its current shape before, but that doesn't make it any less of a country. Like, really important to underline that. Russia also has never existed in history in its current shape either, and it's taken many different shapes. Poland, is a new formation in its current shape. Germany, this is an area of imperial conquest and empires growing and shrinking over time, and so all of these countries, as they come into the contemporary world, are amalgams of different parts. So that Ukraine's an amalgam doesn't make it any less of a country, despite what Vladimir Putin might tell you, than any of its neighbors. Fast forward to contemporary Ukraine, and what I'm going to do now is take a little bit through the post-Soviet experience, because I think it's really important to understand that in order to get a grasp on what's been going on in Ukraine in the last few years, and why Vladimir Putin in particular sees Ukraine as such a huge threat. I was going to pause to say that you'll notice for the rest of the talk, I don't think I mentioned this up front, I meant to, but I'm going to analyze this story very much through the lens of Ukraine and Ukraine's experience. Because that's the right place to start. It's the right place to do it from, I think. But it's also a perspective that tends to get neglected in the popular press. We talk all the time, and millions of words, literally millions of words, have been written over the years about what does Russia want? And more specifically, more often, they say, what does Putin want? What does Vladimir Putin want? And the truth is, we don't know the answer to that question. And the truth is, it's not even, I think, the most important way to look at this. The real story here, as I hope to convince you, is the stunning developments in Ukrainian politics over the last 30 years that have changed its nature, the nature of its relationship with Russia, changed its nature as a state and as a country, and in some sense has led us to where we are today. So that's just to sort of set out the perspective that I'm going to present. You'll see on this map, this is a map of the voting in Ukraine's independence referendum that took place in 1991 on exit from the Soviet Union and the creation of a newly independent Ukrainian state. And as you'll see, it was not close. 92.3%, more than 9 out of 10 voters approved of independence. You'll also see that support was massive all across the country. In the 90s, in almost every part of Ukraine, and even in Donetsk and Lugansk, these regions that are currently claimed by Russia. In the east, their support was 83%. So very substantial support, even in places that were heavily populated by ethnic Russians and almost entirely populated by Russian speakers. The only place where it was even close was Crimea. You see, Crimea, the vote was in the 50s. So even Crimea voted for independence as part of Ukraine. But there, the situation was noticeably different, I think, in terms of the distribution of the vote than the rest of the country. That unanimity, that consensus, that support for independence in Ukraine and for a singular conception of Ukraine came under a lot of pressure after independence actually happened. And there are a number of reasons for it, some of them political, but I think the primary reasons for it are economic. And when Ukraine embarked upon its independence, it also experienced a massive economic catastrophe, a massive economic decline. All of the countries that escaped from communism or left communism in 1989 or 1991, including Russia, including Romania, including Poland, experienced an economic contraction. They experienced something bigger than the Great Recession of 2009. For Russia and Ukraine and most of the former Soviet states, it was bigger than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Incomes in the countries fell dramatically by at least a third. There's debates amongst economists about how you measure this stuff, but essentially there was an enormous economic decline. But Ukraine had the worst of it, the worst of the lot. And as you can see on this map, this chart shows it's the change in GDP per capita. What that means is average incomes, and the path, the way average incomes have grown or haven't grown since independence. And you see in somewhere like Romania, there was or Poland, there was a short downturn. It was significant when your income falls 10%. That's a lot. When it does it 2 years in a row, that's huge. But fairly quickly, incomes grew, the economy recovered, and people are now roughly 2.5 times better off than they were upon the collapse of communism. Over 30 years, that's pretty good. It's pretty significant. Russia had an enormous collapse. About a third of its GDP disappeared. Incomes fell very substantially, and they fell substantially for a long time, for a decade. But they started to pick up just around the same time that Vladimir Putin came into office. In politics, it's always better to be lucky than good, and Putin was certainly lucky. He gets maybe some credit for it. We can discuss that, but essentially what happened was the prices of oil and hydrocarbons, on which the Russian economy depends really heavily, shot through the roof, and this buoyed the Russian economy. And by towards the end of Putin's second term, essentially the purchasing power of the Russian economy was double what it was, of Russian citizens rather, it was double what it had been at the time of the collapse of communism. And then Ukraine, you see, had this huge fall, the biggest fall of the lot, and even now have only just about reached the level of income that they did at the end of the communist period. Now, it's probably really, in actual fact, a little bit higher. Quality of life is better, but not dramatically so. And this is one of the major reasons Ukraine has continued to have political troubles throughout this period. And one of the big explanations for this poor performance, and we could have a whole seminar, a whole series of seminars on that particular question, but one of the main reasons is corruption. Ukraine has had the most corrupt economy in that space, in the post-Soviet space. It's cleaned its act up considerably, and so now it's better than Russia, but it's still pretty corrupt. And money gets siphoned out of the economy and into the West, and off to offshore accounts. The economy is dominated by oligarchs, a term you'll have heard many times, I'm sure by now. Very, very rich businessmen who control not just large parts of the economy, but as a result, they also control large parts of the political system. And they pay for legislation, and this prevents the development of a proper rule of law system upon which the economy can develop. These economic problems have been a major problem for Ukraine, and have meant that it's been very difficult to develop unity around either an economic program or an individual who's been able to draw credit for success in transforming the economy. So Putin consolidated his power through the 2000s on the back of the enormous growth in the Russian economy. He got the credit for it, whether it was his credit to be claimed or not, and politics consolidated around him. In Ukraine, there was nobody like that. And so what happened was that politics became a game between different oligarchic groups. These groups tend to be separated between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. An emblematic election for this was the Ukrainian election of 2004, in which a mafioso, a gangster, really, spent time in prison, from the city of Donetsk in Eastern Ukraine, by the name of Viktor Yanukovych, ran for president against a politician called Viktor Yushchenko from the west of Ukraine, but a politician who was also very much in the pocket of different oligarchs within Ukraine. And what you saw was this incredible division across the country, where in Donetsk and Lugansk, more than 90% of people voted for Yanukovych, and very high numbers in most of the east and south. And then in the other half of the country, by contrast, most people voted for Viktor Yushchenko. In the west of Ukraine, up to 90%, over 90% in a number of regions. And so you see Ukraine divided very harshly politically along this axis. The results of this election were contested. They were incredibly close. Yanukovych was declared the winner. Yushchenko contested and led what became known as the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution was a political revolution complaining about fraud in that 2004 election, and more broadly about corruption as a whole in Ukraine. And this was the moment when corruption really crystallized itself as a key political issue in Ukrainian politics. Very long story short, Yanukovych was rejected by the Supreme Court. A new election was run, which Yushchenko won relatively handily, and took power. He took power, but failed to implement really any serious economic reforms. He failed to implement any serious anti-corruption reforms. None of the promise, in other words, of the revolution materialized, but instead he sort of doubled down on a strategy that emphasized Ukrainian language, West Ukrainian history, and including the glorification of people that fought for Ukrainian independence during the Second World War, but were considered in the east of Ukraine to be Nazi collaborators. And so a divisive agenda that would split the country considerably again. And as you see in the next presidential election, which took place in 2010, Yanukovych ran again. This time he ran again against an oligarch called Yulia Tymoshenko, a female politician who some of you may be familiar with. She's pretty famous. And again, the country divided on exactly the same lines. The East and South voted heavily for Yanukovych, the West and North for Tymoshenko. In this case, Yanukovych won this time and became president, more or less fair and square, I think, actually. But this fundamental division across the country remains. The division itself became a very, clearly it was the central issue in Ukrainian politics. and it became associated with a division between those in Ukraine who wanted to follow a European path, who wanted closer relations with the European Union. He's typically associated with the West and the North of Ukraine, and those who favored closer relations with Russia, the East and the South. And Yanukovych, actually, although he was often presented as being, Russia's puppet, he wasn't really. He was a Donetsk gangster, and he wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to straddle this divide. He wanted to continue to be in power. He didn't want, the gangsters from Russia coming in and taking over from his rackets, right? And his oligarchs, and Ukraine to become an appendage of this richer, bigger country. So he was trying to straddle this divide, but in the end, the Russians put a lot of pressure on him. And in the fall of 2013, he announced that the expected signing of a trade treaty with Europe that everyone had been waiting for was not going to happen after all. And then instead, Ukraine was going to join in an economic alliance with what's called the Eurasian Customs Union, which is an economic alliance with Russia. This provoked a revolution. It really goes by two names, this revolution, that really got going in the fall of 2013, culminating in February of 2014. Many people call it the Euromaidan revolution because it was really a revolution in the beginning about joining the European Union, and so it was a revolution over Ukraine's political destiny. But it also goes by the name of the Revolution of Dignity, and it goes by that name because in response to brutal repression of protesters on the part of the Yanukovych government, a big resistance movement emerged in the name of dignity, in the name of respect for people and their civil rights and their human rights and their political rights. This was, like all revolutions, a revolution that brought in a lot of different people. It brought in pro-EU Democrats. You'll see on these flags on the left-hand side, there's flags of Ukraine, there's flags of the European Union. There's also the flags, the Svoboda, the flag on the left, which kind of looks like a hand. That's a far right political party flag. There's black and red flags, which represent the resistance in the Second World War that's associated with collaboration with the Nazis. And so this was a very mixed crew of people spanning the whole political spectrum in Ukraine. And so this was a really fascinating and broad-based revolution. It ended up in violence. The shooting began. There's debates over who started it, but most likely it was Yanukovych's people who started shooting into the crowd. Shots were returned, and in the end, Yanukovych fled, right, and ran off to Russia. And the full kind of indignity and disgusting nature of the corruption was laid bare before the Ukrainian people. And this launched what I really think of as being, it's not just a political revolution, though clearly it was a political revolution, but the beginning of a very significant cultural shift in Ukraine that helps to explain why Ukraine is the country it is today. At the same time, taking advantage of the revolution in Kiev, Russia moved to annex Crimea. And most importantly there, I think, that includes taking permanent control of the Black Sea Fleet naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea, and thus keeping it out of the hands of NATO, which I think was a big part of the reasoning. But Russia also sponsored, supported, and in the end propped up revolts in eastern Ukraine, in the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. There was some struggle, efforts on the Russians to push those revolts further into Ukraine and take the whole of those regions, but the Ukrainian military, after a really unsteady start, pushed them back. And that war has been going on ever since. So if you speak to Ukraine and you say, the war began on February the 24th, most of them will not agree with you. Most of them will say the war began in 2014 and we've been fighting it for 8 years. And the truth is 10,000 people have been killed along a line of contact in eastern Ukraine over those 10 years, over those 8 years, sorry. And so it's a very legitimate position to think that that's really where the war began. Back in Ukraine, the cultural effects of the revolution, of the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity, were enormous. And again, this is, I teach a whole class on this, but one of the things that happened was the consolidation of Ukrainian civil society, enormous growth that emerged really from the experience of the Orange Revolution, where they said, well, listen, we had this revolution before, and we all went on the streets and we demanded civil rights and we demanded anti-corruption reforms, and we left it to the politicians to take care of it. And what happened? Well, nothing, right? The politicians went back to their old corrupt ways, unimpeded. So this time we can't do that. This time we've got to take control of the process ourselves. Many different civil society initiatives emerged. One of the most prominent of which was this organization called the Reanimation Package of Reforms. Not a great name in English, but makes more sense in Ukrainian. And they put together a roadmap of reforms for all sorts of different sectors, for education, for the economy, for the energy sector, for the judicial sector, for the civil service, for prisons, you name it, they had a reform plan for it. And these reform plans were worked out by the civil society activists and experts across the country, and then were presented to the government as, okay, this is what you got to do. They were also presented to international donors as this is what you need to support the Ukrainian government in doing. This is what reform would actually look like. And over the years since the Euromaidan revolution, what we've seen is this really interesting cooperation between the international community on the one hand, who are putting up the money for a lot of these reforms, and the Ukrainian civil society, who are policing them, who are trying to drive the reforms forward, and who are calling out the government when corruption occurs. I had a really interesting interview in just so it would be 2017, I think, just before the elections, parliamentary elections of 2019 to 2017, with the chair of the Anti-Corruption Committee in the Parliament. And Igor Solovyev, his name was. And Solovyev told me one thing. He said, who do you think's on this committee? And I was like, well, probably people who are interested, parliamentarians who are interested in anti-corruption. And he said, no, that's me. I'm the only one who's interested in anti-corruption. The other 14 people in the committee are the 14 most corrupt MPs in the Ukrainian parliament. And their job here is to stop us from doing anything and to put loopholes in all the legislation and make it difficult for anti-corruption to proceed. And his job was to televise the proceedings, was to get the word out when they were doing this kind of behavior, and to try and involve both the Ukrainian public and the international community in the effort to push the reforms back on track and to call out secretive efforts to impede the reform process. And this went on all across Ukraine in many different sectors. And so gradually, and with a lot of trouble, but a lot of backwards and forwards, the reformers and civil society pushed Ukraine into becoming a much more democratic place, a significantly less corrupt place. They radically reformed, for example, the police. They abolished the traffic police and introduced an entirely new system of traffic police based on Western models, paid for mostly by Western governments, and really transformed Ukraine in a very significant way. At the same time, there was a huge increase in civic identity amongst Ukrainians. We did surveys in Ukraine going back to 2012 and followed the same individuals over time up to 2019, asking them questions about things like what languages did they speak at home, what they conceived of as being their homeland, what kind of languages they spoke at work, what kind of national identity they felt they had. And what we saw was not massive, but nonetheless important changes across the country in the extent to which people were saying, hey, I'm Ukrainian. I may speak Russian. I may even be ethnically Russian. My parents might be Russian, but I'm a Ukrainian. And whereas before, these same individuals before the Euromaidan revolution would say, "Oh well, I was born in the USSR. That's really, my motherland is the Soviet Union, or my motherland is Russia." And they started saying, "No, well, actually, my motherland now is Ukraine." And that growth in civic identity is really, really marked, and you see it in a number of different ways. It's uneven to a certain extent, more marked in the west and the north than in the south and east. But even so, you still see it all across the whole of the country, and that's another really, really important thing that happened in the Euromaidan revolution. And this process of Ukraine becoming more democratic, and at the same time more Ukrainian, and so further from Russia, and more of a contrast to Russia's corrupt and repressive political system, authoritarian political system, is what makes Ukraine a challenge to Vladimir Putin and his rule in Russia. That's what really makes this political, what makes Ukraine's existence into a political problem for Putin, or at least potentially a political problem for Putin. So that's a really important part of the story to understand. The other element that happened is really on the political side. We started to see the disappearance of the huge divide that we had before between east, west, north, and south in Ukraine. In the elections immediately following the Euromaidan, the winner of the elections was an oligarch. He's called the Chocolate King because he owns the most famous chocolate factories in Ukraine, and that's where he made his money. A guy called Petro Poroshenko. And Poroshenko is basically on the old model. He's an oligarch, and he was the candidate of the west part of Ukraine. And you see here, his vote is marked in red, and places that voted majority against Poroshenko are marked in blue. And you see again the similar pattern. It's not quite as marked as it was in the previous elections, but nonetheless it's still there. You contrast that with what I call Zelensky the unifier, who completely changes the electoral map of Ukraine. Here you see the vote for Zelensky in green and Poroshenko in kind of browny orange in the 2019 presidential election. And what you see is that people all across the country vote for Zelensky. There's more in the south and east, but majorities all across the whole country. And that's in large part because Zelensky presents himself as a Ukrainian, but he's a Russian speaker. His Russian is better than his Ukrainian, although his Ukrainian's gotten a lot better over the last few years. He is of a Ukrainian family. He's also Jewish. And so he presents a different kind of identity from Poroshenko, who ran in the end on a very militant nationalist Western Ukrainian style line. And so Zelensky was able to unite the country in a way that it hadn't been united before. And part of that is down to, there's many reasons for it, but part of that is down to his identity as a civic Ukrainian, and that growth of that civic identity that I mentioned a few minutes ago in the aftermath of the Euromaidan revolution. All right, so that's sort of kind of what was going on in Ukraine up until the declaration of war. This growth in civic identity, the emergence of a much more united country under the leadership of Vladimir Zelensky, and then the Russians invade. And what we see, and there's different sort of ways of interpreting what's happened. This map is actually from yesterday of where the war is, and it shows you where the areas the Russians have taken and Ukrainian counterattacks. And there are different interpretations of this map. And I actually read an interesting article in the New York Times yesterday that was arguing that actually this war so far has not been a failure. But actually, you look at this map, you can see how it's been successful. That what's happened really is the Russians have, emerging out of Crimea, they've not taken Kiev in the top. But now there's speculation as to whether they really wanted to do that in the first place anyway, right? that was a feint, it was a diversion. And what they really wanted to do was take more territory in the south in order to close off the Black Sea coast. This would cut Ukraine off entirely from trading with the rest of the world, which is incredibly problematic if you live in Africa, because that's where your food comes from, for the most part. It's also incredibly problematic also for Ukraine as an economic entity, if it is not able to access the sea anymore. And that's why there was so much bombing in Mykolaiv, and clearly plans to move on to the other big port in the south, the port of Odessa. And the Russians have also made some progress, although actually I don't think very much, and impressively little, in Donetsk and Lugansk, where they were supposedly trying to take this territory. And so this can be spun in different ways. You could spin this as being the Russians were successful in many of their military objectives. You could spin this as being it's been a military disaster, because despite the progress in the south, they've not made progress anywhere else, right? I'm not a military expert. As I mentioned in the beginning, I don't know what was in Putin's head at the start of this conflict, fortunately. And so, this is I'm happy to talk about what I think about it, but what I think about it is not really worth all that much. But let me show you some other things about the result of the war that I think are really, really important, and that I know that I'm much more confident in asserting because I have actual data about. One is that, and I apologize, the rest of these graphs are going to be in Ukrainian, but I'll tell you what you need to know. I haven't had time to. They're very new, from a polling agency called the Rating Group, which is conducting polling day by day in Ukraine and publishing the data online. Is a very reputable polling company, so I think these numbers are actually pretty good. But you see, this is the green line on this chart is support for Volodymyr Zelensky, and you see in July of 2019 on the left-hand side of the chart, around when he was elected president, he had support of 70% of the Ukrainian population. And like most politicians, his honeymoon kind of wore off after a while. Some of the promises, some of the bold economic promises, didn't really get delivered upon, and so his support kind of goes down into the 40s. Still pretty good, but lower than before. And so the first thing that Putin does is turn Zelensky into a national hero. Right? His support is now 93%. Zelensky did it himself in response to Putin's invasion. I have to be strictly fair about it, from his extraordinary performance, politically and morally, I think, since the invasion. But the first thing that's happened, regardless of the battlefield, is that support for Zelensky is huge. The second thing that's happened is support for EU accession, something that Putin's supposedly trying to stop, has gone through the roof. This blue line is support for the percentage of people supporting EU accession for Ukraine, starts in the end of 2013 through to the invasion. And what you see is support has kind of trended up over time, particularly since Zelensky was elected, where it's gone into the 60s. But now it's exploded since the invasion, and almost everybody in Ukraine now thinks that Ukraine should become a member of the European Union. Support for NATO, the other thing that Putin's supposedly trying to stop from happening by this invasion, also gone through the roof. It's always been a bit lower than support for joining the EU. Again, the blue line is support for joining NATO. In the 40s, all the way through the period after the Euromaidan revolution, kicks up a little bit with the accession of Zelensky to power, rises up to 60%, and now is as Russia threatens over the last year, and is now again at 3/4 of the population. So a big boost for wanting to join NATO. Here's an interesting question. The question that the rating group asks is are you ready to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine by taking up arms yourself? And the dark green column is absolutely yes. The slightly lighter green is probably yes. And then the red set of answers are no's, right, of various kinds. And what you see is that back before the Euromaidan revolution, a minority of people would have said yes at all, and only 14% said absolutely yes. Following the Euromaidan revolution, that 14% becomes 35%. Right, so it's much, much, much larger. And by this point, a majority of people say they're willing to take up arms to defend Ukraine. And then you see that 35%, kind of grow a little bit as the threat from Russia increased through 2019, through 2020. And then it's exploded now with the invasion. And you would think, when it really push comes to shove and the war is actually there, that you might reconsider. But now 80% of Ukrainians say they're willing to take up arms themselves to fight to defend the territorial integrity of the country. That is really, really, really impressive, and presumably the opposite of what Putin thought would happen with his invasion, and certainly the opposite of what he intended. These charts are super interesting. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but essentially these are charts this particular question is: how confident are you that Ukraine is going to repel Russia's attack? And people who think that Ukraine's going to be successful are in blue, and those that think Russia is going to be successful are in red. And you see back in January on the far left hand side, this is January of 2022, and then the rest of the charts are almost kind of weekly through February and March. And you see the war has persuaded Ukrainians, 93% of Ukrainians, that Ukraine is going to win, which is amazing, and certainly not what was predicted by Western military analysts or by the Russian military analysts in the Kremlin. And then finally, if you ask Ukrainians over the last few years, this is from 2020 compared to 2022, to what extent do you think there's a likelihood that Ukraine will break up, according to different regions? Back in 2020, only 45% of Ukrainians thought it was extremely unlikely that Ukraine would break up. Later that year, it was 37%. Now it's 82%. So four-fifths of Ukrainians are very confident that their country is not going to break up. Again, the opposite of the effect that you would have expected by Russia's invasion. So that's the Ukrainian side. Let me say just a couple of words about the Russian side and what's happened in Russia. The war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, has been accompanied by a very harsh political crackdown in Russia. There have been, according to OVD Info, which is the kind of premier NGO in Russia that monitors these things, it's basically a legal aid organization. More than 15,000 Russians have been arrested for protesting the invasion of Ukraine by their country. Most of them have gone home. Many of them are going to stand trial, though. And if the previous behavior of the Kremlin is anything to go by, the strategy usually is to arrest people, they hold them overnight, and they turn them loose. And then a few months later, they go and arrest them in dawn raids. And in the past, what they've done is publicize this very extensively, and they've been very clear about who's been arrested and why. They arrest a businessman, they arrest a grandmother, they arrest students, they arrest a school teacher. They basically go around different parts of society and arrest one of each social group and do show trials. And some of these people will end up, sadly, I fear, with pretty significant prison sentences. The other thing that's happened is a complete crackdown on alternative information sources. Ever since 2005, really, Russia has not had a free media in terms of national television. The national television has been heavily dominated by state-owned channels. Putin, one of the first things he did was to take over the private channels and either keep them private but give them to his friends, or nationalize them. But nonetheless, there was a very lively independent media ecosystem that existed online, that existed in online TV stations, on YouTube, and in other pretty readily accessible format. One of which was this newspaper Novaya Gazeta, the editor of which is pictured in this image. He was the winner of the Nobel Prize for peace this year for his work in supporting press freedom in Russia. And as of 2 days ago, Novaya Gazeta has suspended operations. So Russia has been a subject of violence and elimination of alternatives, but also mass emigration, especially of young people and above all of highly educated young people and people with particularly degrees in information technology. This is a massive economic blow to Russia. It's a huge cultural blow. It's a political blow to Russia. The emigration that's taking place now is going to be up there with the great emigrations that took place from Russia during the Civil War and the Bolshevik Revolution, and really is going to mark Russian society for many decades to come, whatever happens. Now, there are lots of scholars at my own institution who are visiting from Russia who now can't go home because they know they'll face arrest for their connections with the West when they get there. And so we're working hard to try and find solutions for them and sometimes for their families, but sometimes their families are stuck back in Russia, and so they're now divided. In other words, we're seeing the same tragedy that's happened to Russia before with the Bolshevik Revolution, and something that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. Russia has also become a global outcast. There are sanctions from all around the world. There are sanctions notably from Canada, North America, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia, South Korea. There are not sanctions from China, which is obviously really important, one of Russia's biggest trading partners. And not many African countries have joined in either because they're very worried about food supplies and securing food supplies from Russia and Ukraine, which in a normal year would provide about 50% of the world's grain. And so sanctioning Russian grain would be an act of self-harm on their part. But Russia really, in so many ways, has now become a global outcast and really politically beyond the pale. I will pause here, I think. There are lots of questions that we could talk about. How likely is it to be a negotiated settlement? What might it look like? Can Putin survive his own destruction of Russia? But the question I want to end on is, how can you help? There are many ways to contribute to support of Ukraine, of displaced people within Ukraine. 10 million displaced people in Ukraine out of a population of 40 million. You can imagine the effect that has. The vast majority of them are women and children. 3 million refugees fleeing internationally now, mostly into Poland, but Poland is rapidly filling up. And so there are two things that I would ask you to do. One is to consider donating if you can. There are lots of ways to do it. The link that I have on the slide, razomforukraine.org, is one of the best, longest standing charities in Ukraine that provides that kind of assistance. And they're very efficient with it. They don't waste a lot of money on the administration. They don't have high-paid international staffers. It's very much a local indigenous organization, so I recommend them to you very highly. I also would like to acknowledge the North Carolina Museum of History, who generously agreed to make a donation to Razom to encourage my participation tonight. I'm very grateful to them for that, and I really appreciate it. The other way to help, of course, is to contact your Congress people and speak to them about the importance of visas for refugees. People are not planning on leaving Ukraine, but many women and children have been forced to, and there's just not enough room for the number of them that are in Poland and the neighboring countries and the United States. is beginning to play a role, but it's so far been a very small role. And lobbying your political representatives to do more in that regard would be a real contribution. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay. You are on.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robertson, for that insightful presentation. It helped me, I think, glean a better understanding of the relationship, the long and complex relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Sorry, I apologize for the article there. Ukraine is an independent country and deserves to be treated as such, at the very least verbally, if nothing else. And I think we've all heard reports of how families are divided because of this war. And I am deliberately using the word war. No, that is not a term that President Putin endorses. Many families have relatives on both sides, both from longstanding traditions and also I think the economic downturn you talked about in the early decades, in the 1990s and early part of 2000. Many Ukrainians saw this. There were few jobs in the Ukraine and perhaps more job opportunities in Russia. So you saw a lot of movement across the borders at that time. We have all heard reports of people in the Ukraine contacting family members in Russia who simply don't believe what their relatives are trying to tell them about what's happening in Ukraine because of how tightly President Putin controls the media. And he's cracking down even more so just recently on Facebook, a lot of these online sources, the internet, ways people could get information. How are people in Russia getting information outside of the government sanctions? Are there still channels such as agencies that might be reporting with outside of Russia, but reporting honestly and truly on what's happening, and so that the Russian people understand what's happening and the role their government is playing in these events?
So it's become very hard, I'm afraid. Before the invasion, roughly 70% of Russians got most of their news and information from state television. That the people who did the demographic tended to skew older and less well educated. Young people tended much larger numbers to get their news from social media, and so we're more likely to encounter independent news channels, although very often they would just follow the social media channels of the state TV, or they would be exposed to tweets and retweets and Facebook posts and whatever from family members who were sending messages from state television. But there was a bit of a distinction between people who chose to seek out independent information and those who didn't. And you could, and it wasn't hard. There was a TV station called TV Rain that was online and that ran, like a real news show. Sometimes commenting favorably on the government, sometimes having government ministers on their shows. That's all gone now. TV Rain was shut down. The only sources now of independent media in Russia are outside of Russia. There's a reasonably well-known channel called Meduza, which is operated by journalists who fled not many years ago actually to Latvia, but these are very hard to pick up. They are Instagram is no longer available in Russia. YouTube is no longer available in Russia unless you're quite sophisticated about how to access it. Facebook is not available in Russia, and so the alternative sources of information are of except for a very small group of people being pretty much eliminated.
As a follow-up, and this is one of our audience questions, and I do want to remind our audience that if you have questions for Dr. Robertson, send them to us via the chat function should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. One of our audience members wanted to know your opinion on the U.S. media's coverage of the war in Ukraine, and do you feel it has been of course, it's probably your source, but talking to people you know, your contacts in that part of the world, how accurate and fair do you feel that coverage has been?
Yeah, so I don't, I mean, my main source of information on what's happening in Ukraine is I follow various channels on Telegram, which is a messaging site. And so most of the people that I'm following the news from are either in Ukraine or in Russia. I also, I read the New York Times every day, and I follow some of the television news of our local NBC station in Raleigh, WRAL, has been really generous in having me on a bunch of times. And I would say overall the coverage has been surprisingly good. I've not always been a huge fan of US media coverage of foreign affairs. And I tend to think that the more you know about a place, the less the less impressed you are with the coverage. So places that I actually know well, I'm always like, oh, really? But in this context, in part because this is it's so rare that politics is really black and white. And the media like to present stories in black and white, and so there's always kind of a problem there. The truth is, this situation, it's pretty much as close to black and white as you're ever going to get. There's an enormous clarity here about who the aggressor is, that it's enormously clear this war is entirely unnecessary. It's enormously clear that it's going badly. And it's enormously clear that the Ukrainian side is being incredibly brave and needs support. Now we can, there's details and nuances and whatever, but rarely in my life have I ever seen a political situation in which it was so clear. And I think that makes reporting just a lot easier. And so the quality of reporting, I would say, on the whole, has actually been quite good.
Continuing in the vein of talking about journalism, the free press, free speech, some things that we value quite highly here in America, but I realize are not as available or opportunities for people around the world as we enjoy them here. We've talked a little bit before this program, and you brought it into your presentation, that President Putin, the crackdowns that he is putting on free speech continue to be harsh, and some argue they're the strongest within his ever since he's been in power, which is 22 years now in office. He, under some of the laws that I think have just come into pass in the last few weeks, it's even illegal to refer to this conflict as a war. If you protest the government, it can be seen as treason, and it could be punishable for protesting for up to 15 years in prison. Now, as you said, we've seen a lot of people on television dragged away by the police. They're often released. You believe most of those people have been released, but we're not sure about the safety for all of them. How are we going to be able to find out what's really happening to those people in Russia who are protesting this war?
Yeah, so in some ways, the most moving thing that I've seen in Russia was the woman, and I forget now which town it was. Maybe it was some town in Siberia, standing outside of a church with a piece of paper, so on her own, right? So it's illegal in Russia now to gather in groups of 2 or more. But she was on her own, and she had a piece of paper, and on the piece, she was holding a piece of paper outside a church with one of the 10 commandments: "Thou shalt not kill," was what it said on her piece of paper, and she got arrested for being an anti-war protester. I mean, it's got to that stage where there is no free speech now in Russia to the extent that there was before. I've been doing opinion polling in Russia for gosh, a long time now, 20 years. And right up until last year, you could ask Russians, right up until December, you could ask Russians very frank questions, and they would be very open about their opinions on political subjects. Even as far as asking them, we used to run these questions: how do you feel about President Putin? And one of the options was, I hate him. And people would say that, significant numbers of people would check that box. I don't know how that's all going to be anymore. That's now very dangerous to do and to talk about. And so I think the context is just completely different now from what it was before. And Russia is now, in terms of the information environment, I would say worse than even the Brezhnev era. So we're talking a long time now, and it's early days. This has only been going a month. In my experience, freedom of speech in Russia doesn't get better without very significant political change. It only gets worse. So I'm very concerned about the direction of travel.
Thank you for that. I think that concern is shared by a lot of people. I have another question coming from one of our viewers. You were talking about the history between Russia and Ukraine, and even that many Ukrainians would say this is not a new war. This war has been going on since 2014. It's part of this extended process with the annexation of Crimea. There are people really wondering about that. How can Russia come in and claim, just annex part of another country? What enabled them to do that? And why wasn't there perhaps more pushback from other countries around the world, such as we're seeing now?
Yeah, well, so Crimea was the annexation of Crimea was popular in Russia. Extremely popular, it turned out. Much more popular, I think, even than the Kremlin imagined. In part because Crimea is majority ethnic Russians, although the very large Tatar-speaking and ethnic Tatar minority. Crimea had been part of Russia until the 1950s, when, for really administrative reasons, Khrushchev transferred it over to Ukraine. And it also was militarily very significant for Russia's defense. It's essentially their only warm water port. And so there was within Russia certainly, and to certain people in the West, there was kind of a case for it. And the Ukrainians did not resist effectively. They barely resisted at all. In fact, the Ukrainian military was completely corrupt and completely caught off guard, and by the speed of the attack, and by the nature of the attack, and by the new tactics. And so I think really there was a sort of political acceptance in the West that, well, maybe it's okay to take Crimea, right? And one thinks about the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, that Hitler did in the late 1930s. It was the unprovoked invasion and annexation of another country, but it's not so clear that we really care about it. And if that's all he's going to do, then it's okay. We don't want to fight about it. And I think that was very much the attitude. What's also happened in this war that nobody talks about is Russia has effectively annexed Belarus as well. Right? Belarus now does not control its own borders. The Russians control their borders. The Russians have created these new bases in Belarus, and the decision maker in Belarus now is no longer Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is also a monster, but other Russians, and that doesn't get talked about much. But what's very clear about this all-out assault, none of those Weasley words or kind of pusillanimous arguments that people could make about, oh well, it's not really up to us, it's not really a threat to us, so let's not make too much of a fuss about it. None of that holds, and it's so obvious now that Russia represents a threat to its neighbors, represents a threat to democracy, represents a threat to NATO, that I think that time has passed.
Right. We have another question. When the invasion started and in the lead up to the invasion, or as Putin would call it, special operation or military operation, he justified it that the Russians were going into Ukraine to demilitarize and denazify the country. You talked a little bit about some of the different political parties and some of the divisions, and how now Ukraine is more united politically than they've probably ever been, certainly in this century. But there are some neo-Nazi factions in parts of the Ukraine, and that were having influence. So not that we justify this war in any way, but how valid were some of those arguments?
So I get this question a lot, and I think it's incredibly important to be crystal clear about it. So I'm glad you asked. There are far-right supporters in Ukraine in the same way that there are far-right supporters in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany. They are very small in number. They were important in the end of the Maidan Revolution, when it turned into street battles, because these guys were trained and they know how to fight and they were heavily armed. And so when it came to fighting street battles in really what was effectively a 2-block area of the capital, I mean, this revolution took place in an incredibly small space. It's kind of stunning. Where small numbers of well-trained, heavily armed guys could make a difference, they were important. As soon as they moved past that part of the revolution to the elections afterwards, the far-right parties took 2% of the vote. One or two of their politicians remained reasonably important in the background because they had been, commanders in the Maidan, and then they were all swept out of office when Zelensky took power in 2019. There was a new parliamentary election after Zelensky took power, in which his party, you could not have been a parliamentarian before to be able to run for his party. You had to be a newcomer entirely. Took 70% of the seats. And so those people played no role in Ukrainian politics of any significance. They play a role in intimidating Romani people. They play a role in street fighting. They play a role as thugs in some towns. But it's not of a political level of that there really is of any significance. It's a policing and civil rights kind of issue. And so it's a total red herring to think of the government of Ukraine and Nazis in the same sentence at all. And I try to be very honest about it, because I think to say there are no fascists in Ukraine would be a lie, but that would be a lie about almost everywhere. And so being very clear about the nature of that situation, I think, is super important.
There was a talk yesterday in Turkey between representatives from Ukraine and Russia, talks of a possible peace engagement, and both sides came out very hopeful, though there is some perhaps doubt on certain Western countries that we can rely on Putin to follow through with the peace treaty. How about your opinion of that? Do you feel, and I'm going to read this question right from one of our audience members, about the politics of ceasefire, how likely is it that we can come to a peaceful resolution and with the involvement of other countries from the West and other parts of the world, and bring this matter to some type of peaceful resolution, with leaving it so that Ukraine is still an independent sovereign nation?
Yeah, this is very hard. I'm not optimistic at all. A little bit of context here, I guess a personal confession. I began my career in my 20s working as a diplomat, and I worked on the peace conference on the former Yugoslavia. And for 4 years of my life I went to work every day and negotiated with Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia over the war in Bosnia. And I got really burned by that experience, because I saw this pattern whereby the Serbs would start to talk seriously when they were having a military problem, and then they would talk in these ambitious terms about the kind of deals we could make, and then once that military problem was solved, they lost interest in the negotiations again. And that's a little bit what's happening now in the negotiations in Turkey. It reminds me of that. The Russians, their offensive has come to a standstill. Even if it had been successful, a month in is when they would probably need to start re-equipping, reorganizing. And so they say, okay, we're pretty close to a deal here, and we're talking about it seriously. They don't do anything on the ground to match the talk, which again was something I saw a lot of in Yugoslavia. So I'm very skeptical that they're serious. Even if they were serious, they're not serious about giving back Crimea. They're not serious about giving back the Donbass. And so they're asking Zelensky to agree to a settlement that would, that's not supported by Ukrainians. Those numbers that I showed you about the percentage of Ukrainians who think they're going to win this war, and think they're going to win it soon. I didn't show you that, but most of the people think it's going to be a matter of a few weeks. That creates an enormous pressure for him to take a hard stance. So these two sides around this table, they don't even agree what the word Ukraine means, right? And what territory it covers. So I'm unfortunately pretty skeptical. I hope to goodness I'm wrong. But I'm pretty skeptical that there's a deal that the Russians would sign that Zelensky could tolerate. There's definitely scope for some kind of agreement around, not joining NATO. But again, there's a lot of disagreement over even what that would mean. What the Ukrainians are asking for right now is, okay, we won't join NATO, but we need a security guarantee that's enforceable by law by these 6 countries, which is kind of sort of like NATO plus. So I don't, I unfortunately, I just think we're not at a point yet on the battlefield where someone's likely to give.
You presented the map and showed us how the Russian advancement of troops and how it's really centered around certain regions leading down to the Crimea. And you presented the argument that some have said that maybe that was Putin's main goal, was to secure the Black Sea area, is that a trading route, as a military route, etc. We've had some audience members wonder about how some of the other former Soviet countries or how are they feeling? Are they concerned that they may experience these types of aggression, that they might be invaded by Russia? But I can think of, many of the neighbors around them. You talked about Belarus has lost its independences for all practical purposes. Is this something that's a very valid fear, in your opinion? And is it something that's being discussed in these countries?
Oh, for sure. The most nervous country of all is Moldova, which, as I mentioned briefly, is not in NATO, so doesn't have any security guarantees, and already has a third of its territory, the main industrial part of its country, occupied by a breakaway republic. It's been there since the very beginning of independence, and it's been there since 1991. A revolt that was sponsored by the Soviet Fourth Army. And clearly, they're next over, and they're the next domino. They're also, most people probably don't know this, they're also a country that's twinned with North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And so we do a lot of projects together with the Moldovans, the UNC Dental School.
They're the poorest country in Europe, but they're there.
The poorest country in Europe, and by a distance. It's not even close. And so we have close connections between our state and Moldova. And the Moldovans are extremely worried and are absolutely right to be. The good news for them is that if the Russian advance really does get stopped, well short of Odessa, then they should be okay. But if the Russian advance in the south, Mykolaiv, Odessa, across the Black Sea, then Moldova is next in line. And if the Russian invasion turns out to be successful, why would they go? Why would they stop? And Moldova would be relatively speaking straightforward.
In fact, we've had some questions about Moldova, so I'm glad you brought that up. One question in particular is there is a rumor that Russia has troops stationed in Moldova. Do you know anything about that? If that's true, or perhaps just false information?
So I'm sure it's true to a certain extent. I don't know that there are large numbers of troops, but there are certainly military advisors training the Moldovan. So the breakaway republic is called Transnistria, and the Transnistrian army is a creation of the Russians. It was formed out of a breakaway unit of the Soviet army, and is supplied and supported by the Russians. So they already have a foothold there. That's very straightforward.
We've had some audience members suggest that perhaps Putin is trying to essentially reassemble the Soviet Union and bring that all under Russian territory, not perhaps the name, but to reestablish those boundaries and the power and influence that the Soviet Union had. And that's another reason that we need to be concerned, not only on behalf of Ukraine and its people, but the long-term implications for what that means. I do have to ask you, though, what do you think? And this is just an opinion because we don't know, and we're going speculation. Even though, as you have clearly shown, and we've talked about tonight, the Russian media is state controlled, essentially. There a lot of information is not necessarily getting to the average Russian citizen. Clearly, the oligarchs, the military leaders, they know what's happening with the conflict and whether it's going well or not. Do you think Putin is in danger of losing his power and influence in Russia if this war or invasion does not go as he, and it's not, I don't believe, go as he foresaw?
So the short answer to that is yes, but not very much in danger, right? And the longer answer is that what we've seen very obviously since this war began is a split between most of the oligarchs and Putin's people. And it's demonstrated the oligarchs are losing money. They're losing yachts. They're using access to their villas in Italy, and the main propagandist on Russian TV complains regularly on TV in the evening that he can't go to his 2 villas in Italy anymore. He actually, it turns out, has 4 villas around Lake Como. But so there's the Russian super rich are hurting. No question about it. Should they, am I crying myself to sleep over that at night? No. Should they be hurting more? Yes. But do they have much influence on Putin? Unfortunately not. The way that the Russian economy has developed over the last few years, last decade or so, is that Putin is kind of he gets to decide who gets to keep what. And he also gets to take things from you if he wants. And so the oligarchs are subservient to Putin. They're more like supplicants. They're incredibly powerful within their own sphere, but in the political sphere, they're weak, and Putin tells them what to do. And so they're very unlikely to have much influence over events. The threat to Putin comes from a military establishment with whom he has now fallen out, by all accounts, pretty significantly over the poor quality of information that he got, and splits within his own security forces, primarily what's known as the FSB, which many of you will have heard of. It's one of the successors of the KGB. Russia has lots and lots of different security forces. This is a hallmark of dictatorships, is you can't trust the security forces because they might overthrow you, so you divide them into lots of different groups. And that's what Putin's done very effectively. And so while if there is discontent within those security forces and the possibility of essentially of a coup, I think that's real, but it is very divided and hard to organize something. And there is very little tradition of horizontal communication between people at different levels in the security forces, so that communication is up. So most coups come from young, junior officers, and they're very divided institutionally and organizationally in Russia, which just makes it much harder to organize a coup of any kind.
And we have seen that those who oppose Putin politically, unfortunately, seem to encounter very poor health. Bad things happen to them. Poisoning seems to befall a lot of these figures. So, there's always a danger going there. Dr. Robertson, you study authoritarian regimes. That is one of your areas of specialization. Looking at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine and what's happening around the world, do you think authoritarianism is on the rise in the world today?
So I think unquestionably that's true. There has been, the countries that were already pretty authoritarian, like Russia, have become much more authoritarian. China continues to grow, continues to spread its influence around the world. And a number of countries like Hungary and Poland that used to be democratic have wobbled and have seriously slid back towards more authoritarian forms of government. It may be that what's happened in Russia will scare them straight. That maybe the Polish government, for example, has been a big friend of Ukraine and has been accepting, as I said, millions of displaced people, and in the process is getting away with a little bit sort of whitewashing its reputation, which was very bad as an authoritarian and an intolerant government. And so maybe they're gonna, now they see where their allegiances lie, they're going to move back more towards the EU, I hope. but it's unquestionable that there is the rise of authoritarianism around the world was clear and growing. And if Putin is successful in this, it'll get worse. That's yet another reason why Putin has to be stopped. People in Taiwan, for example, are watching this very, very carefully. And if we can't stop Putin, then we're probably not going to be able to stop China from taking Taiwan, and then that's obviously a really serious issue.
Well, thank you. We've gone on for almost an hour and a half, but our audience is still with us, which tells us how compelling this presentation has been and how important it is. I'm going to close with just maybe last question, asking you what else do you think that the U.S. and its allies can do? Have we done enough for the Ukraine? Are the sanctions working? Should we be doing more? And then if you wouldn't mind repeating before we close the Ransom for Ukraine, perhaps even showing that screen again. We put it out on the chat, but I know there's some people who would like to make donations there. So I know that I threw a lot at you there, but if you could sort of assess that and share that charity with us one more time.
Yeah, so I don't know if you can see my screen, but I put it back up on my screen, and I put it in the chat just a second ago.
No, we can't.
I can't see it, but I'll repeat it. How about that? If you want to answer the question about the sanctions, and then I will verbally try to go through the link to the charity.
Perfect. So the sanctions have been bigger than anyone thought, and the United States played a really big role in creating those sanctions and getting in particularly Germany on board, and that's been terrific. There are further sanctions we could do. We still oil and gas has not been sanctioned. That would be a huge step. It would be useful also, I think, for getting us off fossil fuels, but that's a longer term issue. But definitely that needs to be done. The military support has been really impressive in terms of providing equipment for Ukraine, and I think has played a really critical role in the war. So I think the administration and the Europeans get a solid B+ and maybe even an A- for their response. The next stage is to really come through with support for displaced people. That's really I think the most important thing that we can do in the short term.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat the charity, and just to let you know, Dr. Robertson was being very kind. In lieu of accepting an honorarium tonight, he asked that the museum make a donation to this charity, and we were happy to do so. So that just speaks to his integrity more than the museum's, I would like to think. Hopefully, we have high integrity as well, but I want to make sure he gets the credit for that. The charity that he recommended is Ransom for Ukraine, and I will spell that. It's all run together. It's RAZOM for FOR Ukraine, UKRAINE, no spaces, .org. If you go to that site, they have information on how you can help and how you can donate, so that your money is going to a good charity that has been well vetted and can guarantee that the funds will get to help the people of Ukraine. So
I would say Razom is the Ukrainian word for together. So it's Together for Ukraine is the name of the charity in Ukrainian.
I did know that. That makes perfect sense. So I do encourage you, if you can, please visit that site or look at their other charities as well. For those of you who can give, I know that it will be greatly appreciated. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Graham Robertson from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who's been kind enough to come with us this evening. It's probably been a long day for you, Professor. I know you have a full load with your teaching, your classes, and as well as your administrative duties there. This has been very informative. I want to thank you for sharing this information with us, answering a lot of our questions, and raising some questions that I think we will continue to discuss amongst ourselves. And this is what we'd like to do here at the Museum of History, be a place in the community where people can come to learn about history, whether that history happened 2 centuries ago or it happened this morning. We want to be that site for you. And this is our new series. That's what we hope to accomplish with the NC Special Edition series. We want to present current events and also groundbreaking and new research on historical topics. And I think this is a great way to launch the series. Thank you all for joining us. And once again, our special thanks to our guest, Dr. Graham Robertson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my honor.